The views and opinions expressed on Reasonably Speaking are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the American Law Institute or the speakers' organizations. The content presented in this broadcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. Please be advised that episodes of Reasonably Speaking explore complex and often sensitive legal topics and may contain mature content.
Welcome to Reasonably Speaking. I am pleased to welcome Suzanne Goldberg and Gil Sparks. They are here today to discuss how colleges and universities respond to sexual assault allegations on campus. Suzanne Goldberg is a professor of law and director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. She also serves as executive vice president for University Life at Columbia University, where she works on sexual assault prevention and response and an array of other issues related to inclusion, belonging, and ethical leadership. Gil is a consulting member of the Corporate and Business Litigation Group and the Delaware Corporate Counseling Group at the law firm Morris Nichols in Delaware. In addition to his corporate law practice, he is currently a member of and past chairman of the Board of Trustees of the University of Delaware. So, welcome, Suzanne and Gil. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
We're here today to talk about assault allegations on campus and the adjudication processes that schools and universities are putting in place. Some of our listeners may not understand why colleges and universities are involved in adjudicating these things at all. Can you tell me why it's important for schools to be the ones that address a lot of these misconduct claims?
Suzanne, why don't you kick off and I'll fill in.
Okay, sounds perfect. Right, so, great question. Lots of people have it, and there are a couple of answers. One is the legal answer. So schools have obligations under federal law, in particular Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education by schools that receive any federal funding, which is most higher education institutions in the country. We know that sexual misconduct, sexual assault, and other kinds of sexual misconduct have a significant impact on students' ability to thrive on their campuses. Consequently, schools have an obligation, a legal obligation, to provide adequate support for students and adequate processes to respond to complaints that they receive. Beyond that, educational institutions, as a general matter, have an interest in educating their students and in ensuring that all of their students have an opportunity to thrive, because that's the mission, right? That's why schools do what they do. And so having adequate processes in place to provide support for students if they experience misconduct, and also to analyze and assess, evaluate complaints between one student and another when both students are members of the same community, to be able to evaluate those complaints with fairness and sensitivity to the issues involved.
So in addition to the underlying policy of universities having an obligation, which I think everyone would agree they should have, to create and maintain a safe learning environment for all their students, the only other point I would make is that it also fills a void. The criminal system, which would deal with the most serious sexual allegations and misconduct allegations, and indeed some of the less serious ones, is by definition very slow. And avoids all but the most serious sexual misconduct matters. So there's a whole spectrum of matters that certainly go into the category of creating a hostile environment for learning that nonetheless would not rise to the level of a prosecutor in a state criminal system choosing to prosecute. And so universities, colleges also fill that void.
And let me just add one more point, building on what you just said, Gil, which is that schools handle all sorts of misconduct that occurs between students or by students, right? They handle academic misconduct, but also all sorts of behavioral misconduct, including non-sexual assault, because, again, schools have an obligation to provide a safe and supportive learning environment. And so responding to sexual misconduct complaints is a piece of a much broader fabric of how schools engage with their students when students are accused of having engaged in misconduct.
So tell me, before we move too far ahead, we're talking about schools, universities, colleges. What size, what types of these schools are we talking about that have this responsibility?
Well, let me kick that one off. I sort of jotted down a few of those in anticipation of your question. We're talking about large institutions. We're talking about very small institutions. We're talking about private institutions. We're talking about public institutions. We're talking about commuter institutions versus residential. We're talking about purely secular institutions. And others that have a religious affiliation or background. That's only 8 different categories that we're addressing. Maybe you can think of a few more, Suzanne. I don't know.
Yeah, I think really the categories are endless. I think it's especially important to keep in mind that of the 4,000 plus degree granting higher education institutions in the country, very, very few of them, almost only about 200, few more, have law schools. So most of these colleges and universities that we're talking about on this issue don't have law schools, and roughly half of higher education institutions don't have their own general counsel to advise them. So they outsource the general counsel. There may be no lawyers on staff at all. So in addition to the geographic and cultural and resource diversity that Gil was just describing, there is just also a tremendous difference in the way schools are structured and even how they hire their faculty. Do they use mostly adjuncts? Do they have mostly in-house? And then in terms of the administrative leadership of the school and whether they have lawyers on the staff or not.
Yeah, that sets a very good stage for the next question that I have, which is what's the current legal landscape that these schools are trying to work in right now?
Also a good question. The legal landscape exists at multiple levels. So there are laws at the federal level, right? Title IX, the Clery Act, which has to do with schools' obligations to keep their students safe, the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act. Even in broader scope, public institutions are obligated to follow the U.S. Constitution. And in particular, in this area, what's most significant is the Due Process Clause, which requires government actors to provide a meaningful opportunity to be heard before anyone is deprived of life, liberty, or property. Even for schools that are private and not obligated to follow constitutional guarantees, many schools have committed themselves to following those basic fair process requirements. If you cut a layer lower than the federal law, many states have specifically, or a number of states have specifically addressed the obligations of higher education institutions related to sexual misconduct on campus. New York, for example, has a law called Enough is Enough that has to do with how students have to be trained, ensuring what kinds of information students have related to sexual misconduct and their rights and responsibilities as part of a process, as well as institutions' obligations to report information. And then there's the whole body of ordinary contract law and tort law and so forth. And Gil, maybe you want to expand on some of these
Well, I would
pieces.
only expand a little bit on the contract theory, and that is that when a person comes to a university or other educational institution, there's basically an implied contract that I'm going to pay you money and you're going to give me an education. Underlying the contract theory in common law is the concept of good faith and fair dealing. And so if you push things to an extreme, a private university could find that some judge someday found that a completely inadequate adjudicative process in a serious sexual misconduct case violated concepts of good faith and fair dealing. Beyond that, I think Suzanne pretty much covered the waterfront in her answer.
Yeah, so to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of what is expected of schools, a complaint is made. In that phase where a complaint has been filed and the investigation has not yet started, schools are already obligated to do certain things. Can we start there, and can you tell me what some of these expected things are that schools should be doing at that phase?
Well, from my experience and looking at some of the policies of the university that I've had recent contact with, there are a number of accommodations that can be made in the interim basis before you actually even decide whether you're going to have a serious adjudicatory proceeding. And those can include changing the classes of the complainant, so the complainant is not in contact in the class with the respondent. That can include moving the residence, moving someone out of a dorm. That can include changing, to the extent there's work involved on campus, at a lab or some other place, changing the work assignments of people. It can involve no contact orders that can be entered. It can include escort services that the university would provide for the complainant. It can include increased security. And it even, in some cases, can include temporary bans of the respondent from campus.
Just to build a step back and then join up with where Gil is, even prior to a student making a complaint, an obligation of every school, and I think it's an ethical obligation as well as in some ways, depending on where one is, a legal obligation, is to have information about schools' policies and resources that is clearly accessible to students, right? So it doesn't help a first-year undergraduate much to have a document written as though it is meant to be read by sophisticated lawyers, right? So policies, in my own view, ought to be written in language that is accessible to all. And even when I think about it being accessible to graduate students, a graduate student in chemistry or in medieval studies is not going to be reading a policy in the same way that a law student might read it. So that's number one. And number two is to make sure that students know not only about the policy, but about where they can access resources. So many schools will provide either counseling on campus, traditional residential campuses, well-resourced campuses might provide, often do have counseling and psychological services, may have specialists in trauma, including sexual trauma, who can support students in processing what they have experienced. Beyond that, and for schools that don't have those kinds of resources on their campuses, there's an opportunity for schools to have agreements or at least relationships with off-campus service providers like local rape crisis centers that may be able to provide support in addition to the kinds of shifts that Gil has just mentioned.
The report's been made, and I assume that the school makes the determination of whether or not an investigation should begin.
Right.
So once that happens, tell me a bit about how this generally happens on campus. Does it look like what we see on TV with criminal courts and detectives, or is it significantly different from what people out in the world expect from an investigation?
Yeah, so let me just step back once more, which is that sometimes a student will file a report and say, I have experienced sexual assault, but I don't want the school to do an investigation, right? I do want help moving my classes, or I want a stay away order from that other student or something like that. But because this person is in my social circles, I think it will be more disruptive to my life if a full investigation goes forward. And there's there is some empirical work out there, including a major study that was done at Columbia University called the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, that has produced a number of academic articles that delve exactly into these questions. But if the school makes an evaluation, either the student wants an investigation to go forward, or the school makes an evaluation and feels that in the interest of safety, the investigation should go forward, the next step is for the investigator at the institution to talk to the student who has filed the complaint. So, right, this is not law and order, right? This is a university or college administrator who's employed as an investigator, or someone who the school has hired to investigate, to talk with the student. In most circumstances, the student is free to bring in an advisor, either a lawyer or a support person, to be there with the person while they are being asked questions, because the investigator's job is to figure out what happened, right? So the first stop is to talk with a complainant, and then the next stop may be the complainant, meaning the student who's reported the misconduct. The second stop may be to talk to a witness, or maybe to go ahead and talk with the student who's been accused, who's called the respondent in most of these processes. Gil, I don't know if you want to pick up from there.
So you can have, there are really two different models from that stage on. One of them I would call the hearing model, where a hearing panel then gets the report of the investigator and has its own opportunity to interface with the complainant and the respondent, often separately, and makes a decision, deciding whether, in the vernacular that's used here, whether or not the respondent is responsible for the misconduct or not. There's another model that has the investigator also being the decider. So the investigator talks to all sides. There are other processes that are involved, and the investigator then looks at those facts and makes a decision. In each case, most institutions provide then a level of appeal from those determinations, whether they be in the first model I mentioned or in the second model.
And so then we think, well, does this look like a criminal case? Does it look like, again, what we see on TV? And the answer is, this doesn't take place in a courtroom, right? Whether these are meetings with an investigator or a hearing in front of a hearing panel, this takes place ordinarily in a room within the school. Often the students are not in the same room, but they're connected. Each is talking, if they're being interviewed at the same, sort of as part of the same hearing, they're often connected by sort of video Skype or Zoom or some other kind of format like that. But again, the point, and the investigations can take quite some time because in complicated cases where there are many witnesses, where there may be hundreds or thousands of text messages that went back and forth between students, or other kinds of evidence that an investigator or a hearing panel needs to look at, all of this has to be gathered and evaluated. So that investigation phase, in some cases, can just take a short amount of time, but when it's more complicated, will take longer. And then, as Gil said, sometimes presented to a hearing panel or to the individual investigator who makes a determination about responsibility for the policy violation. And often people say, oh, well, somebody was found guilty of violating a school policy or wasn't guilty of violating a school policy. And it may seem like a small point, but I think it's worth underscoring that this is not a criminal process and nobody is being found guilty or not guilty. The question in these cases is there enough evidence to make a determination that the accused student violated the policy? And sometimes there is, and even in cases where there is not, the decision is not the student did not violate the policy. The decision is there is not enough evidence to show that the accused student did violate the policy.
So to finish up on this, and from the perspective of someone who spent a lot of his career in real courtrooms, the differences that I would notice are generally there's not an active role for lawyers. Often they can be present at each of these stages, but they're not allowed to get up and take the place, if you will, of the respondent or the complainant in the proceeding. They're not allowed to cross-examine in the way Perry Mason would have done, for those who remember Perry Mason. And indeed, in the investigator model that I mentioned, there's no hearing at all. There's nothing you would recognize as a hearing because there's no culminating place where everybody is together at the same time, although the process of providing questions to the investigator resolver, who then can ask those questions of the other side, in effect, in many cases, gets to the same result as the more formalized hearing concept, which even then rarely has the accused and or the complainant and the respondent in the same room together, as you would see in a trial.
And in some ways, the point is that for both students, these can be highly stressful experiences, very difficult matters, very difficult to talk about in any setting, and certainly in the kind of investigation and adjudication setting. And so schools have developed a variety of ways to ensure fairness to both students, because both students are part of the community, and also sensitivity to the issues involved. And there's not one way to do that. And part of going back to our earlier discussion about the tremendous diversity among colleges and universities, that then can be reflected in the kinds of processes that schools use The bottom line point is that the process needs to be, the investigation and decision-making needs to be done by somebody who is fair, who is well-trained, and who is impartial, meaning doesn't come into the decision-making process with a view that, oh, I believe one student more than another, but rather I'm here to hear the evidence and then make a judgment about that evidence based on what I've heard.
Yeah, and whatever process you use, the hearing model, the investigator resolver model, or whatever other model you use, those points that the person is trained, unbiased, and competent are critical. And frankly, if you have someone who meets all those criteria, it probably doesn't make any difference which process you use. They're both going to come out with a sound result. And conversely, if those criteria are not met, whatever process you use, you're probably going to get a more questioned result from the process.
You know, and just along those lines, I mean, one thing that I think is easy for people to forget when they think about sexual misconduct cases on campuses is that these are cases that are being addressed by educational institutions that do actually have a lot of experience addressing misconduct cases. And when I became an academic administrator, I was sort of reminded of how many misconduct cases come to a school's attention. So schools have quite a lot of experience doing this. The school process is one process available to students. Students don't have to use it, but schools must provide the process, and in my view, and I think our shared view, ought to provide a very good process, both legally and for educational reasons. Students also have the option to go to the criminal process or to the civil process, meaning A files a lawsuit against B for money damages. They can engage one of those processes, they can engage all three, or going back to an earlier point in our conversation, they can choose to just an individual who has experienced sexual misconduct can choose to go to the school and say, hey, I need your help. I want to have my class switched. I need counseling. I need other kinds of support. But I don't want to engage any of this because I don't think it's in my own interest. A student could choose that as well, with the understanding that a school always has the obligation to the extent it can, to ensure safety in its community.
And I guess to close on this question, keep in the background and thinking about this as you think about the structure that we've just discussed, is that if the structure is too scary, if you will, too rigid, too much like Perry Mason on television, you are going to get less legitimate reports from people who you want to have report and come forward for campus safety purposes. So there's always this balance between how much do we make this look like a courtroom, which may be the ultimate concept of getting to the last element of truth in every matter, and how much do we want to back away a little bit from that so that we make sure that people aren't afraid to come forward and participate in the process.
And I want to pause on that point for just a moment because, and really underscore it, because there are so many barriers to reporting sexual misconduct, right? We know that sexual assault is one of the very most underreported crimes, and we know many of the reasons, right? Some of those are fear about the process and what will happen. Some of those are fear of public disclosure. Even if I go to a process and it says it's private, what happens if people find out? Some of those have to do with shame, with feeling like, oh, you know, and this has been reported in a number of empirical studies as well as more ethnographic, meaning kind of individualized interviewing-based studies, that some students will say, you know, I feel like it's my fault. I got drunk and this happened to me, but I'm partly responsible. And what we always remind students of is nobody is responsible for being assaulted. Nobody asks to be assaulted. When schools are designing processes and trying to encourage reporting so that students can receive appropriate support and that misconduct can be handled appropriately, schools need to be aware that these are a piece of the reality of the fabric of the social life at many institutions. Again, institutions vary, but at many institutions, especially at college and typical graduate student ages, these are significant issues. not terribly different from some of the barriers we see in other settings.
Indeed, and to try to accommodate some of these issues, some institutions actually grant amnesty on violating alcohol use policies to people who come forward in a sexual assault matter, because you don't want to catch 22. You want the person who's coming forward to be honest. They may have had too much to drink. Many of these cases come up related to alcohol with both parties after 2 in the morning, if you want to know the truth. And it would be a deterrent if you come forward and then it turns out, well, were you drinking? Yes, and then, well, we're going to get you on our alcohol policy. So at least some institutions I'm aware of have formal amnesty provisions that say, if this is what we're talking about, if it's a sexual assault matter, you come forward, you don't have to worry about being caught in a catch-22 by our alcohol infraction policy.
And that's actually, that kind of amnesty that Gil just described is required by New York state law.
So when it comes to larger schools, smaller schools, I think it's probably clear to everybody listening that different schools have different resources. You pointed out that of the 1,000 schools, only so many have a law school where you could turn for some good legal advice to set up some of these procedures. What are some of the smaller schools, maybe the less resourced schools, doing to accommodate all of these obligations? Are there some alternative approaches that they're taking?
I can tell you a couple. First, in terms of advisors that can accompany students, some institutions, some very wealthy institutions actually will provide attorneys. That's very, very few go down that path. Others will train members of the staff and faculty in how to deal with these matters and make a list available to the students and put it in their policy that a list is available, so you know there's someone you can call on who's adept in handling these types of matters. And then in terms of who's going to handle these matters, and especially the most important ones, some big universities are so large that they have enough of these cases that they can actually go out and hire somebody or maybe 2 people to be to fulfill this particular niche, if you will, of student misconduct. Others will go in almost a consortium idea to either in a formal consortium, or they will go to a private law firm that has a person that specializes in hearing these types of matters that may be retained not only by that university, but by others, and finds that to be a way to, in effect, spread the burden of complying. But the key is, and when you get to the hearing type person, whether it's an investigator, resolver, or a hearing officer, is to find some way that you can get a really qualified person to handle the matter.
And one of the many positive follow-ons to having greater attention to the issue of sexual misconduct on campus is that there is tremendous training that is available online that is accessible even for the most remote colleges and universities, and some actually, there are opportunities to find some training for free or at very low cost. So that can be useful to investigators and decision makers. Some schools also, as we were just saying, have peer training. So older students there are lots of schools have a lot of peer mentoring programs, and there's peer advising. So students who are either bringing a complaint or have been accused may be able to have support from a peer. Again, sometimes staff are specially designated to provide that support. Sometimes there are these consortiums, again, where schools come together and try to have sort of shared support. And one of the pieces, again, going back to what schools do generally, is schools do a lot of training, right? Schools are in the business of educating. So there is an openness to, one hopes, an openness to learning, an openness to being educated, and an opportunity to really select individuals who can provide that kind of support in the place to the students who need it.
So we really have only scratched the surface, and we knew that going in, because we could talk a lot about this for a very long time. As we look to close out today, knowing that our listeners may be students, they may be school administrators, they may be lawyers, or they may be parents, actually, of students who are in school. What's
the one thing, the couple of things that you really want people to walk away at least knowing, even if it's knowing a first step toward an end goal?
Why don't you kick off?
Sure. Toward the end goal.
Toward the end goal.
I'll say two. One is, it's very important to remember these are educational institutions. This is a point we talked about earlier, but I think it bears underscoring, which is that students, if they choose, can go to the criminal process. But whether they choose to do that or not, the educational institution has both a legal and an educational mission-related obligation to provide support and fair process for handling misconduct complaints on its own campus. And that process is situated in an education institution, in an educational institution. It needs to be fair, and it also needs to understand that the people involved are students and wind up learning through the process. And the school, even in having a process, educates its broader community about its commitment to fairness. The second actually steps away from what we've been talking about and for me focuses on prevention, because one of the most important contributions a school, college or university, or frankly elementary and secondary schools, high schools can do, is to get students talking about these issues and really talking about these issues, not just sort of the superficial, here, don't do this and don't do that, but engaging in what it means to be a member of a mutually respectful community. And so I'll just mention one thing we've initiated at Columbia University, which is called the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative. It's something that happens after orientation. So students get a lot of information thrown at them during orientation. And really, frankly, many students are most concerned about, will I make any friends? And will I be able to handle the academic obligations? So during the first semester, every new student at Columbia is required to participate in the Sexual Respect Initiative. And part of the point is to ensure that students know where to go if they need support, or if a friend needs support or help, or wants to file a report about misconduct. And part is to link the idea of sexual respect to membership in a university community, to say, even if you would say, I would never do that, or this issue has nothing to do with me, to understand that as part of a broader educational community, it's critical that we all reflect on that link. So we try to support that institutionally and then make other efforts throughout the year to keep the issue one that people can discuss, because again, given the barriers to reporting and talking about these issues, one of the most important things we can do is to say, hey, we've got to talk about these issues like we have to talk about so many other issues, and to not talk about them is part of the problem.
And I have two things that I generally preach in this area. One, we've talked about the decider, whether it's a hearing panel or whether it's an investigator resolver. And I think it is critical that whoever that is identify in writing his or her material factual findings and related conclusions, the conclusions they draw from those facts. And I feel that way for two reasons. Number one, it imposes a discipline on whoever is charged with making that decision. They have to actually sit down and write something and say, this is how I got here. And secondly, it is the only way that you can have a meaningful appeal to determine whether the fact-finding made sense, and frankly, whether the conclusions that were reached logically follow from the facts as found. Secondly, I think it's critical that you have fair, consistent, sensitive, and established procedures publicized in advance so that you can achieve on-campus and, frankly, parental acceptance of decisions that are made. And that's particularly important in a system where people generally understand the criminal system. There's less understanding about the role of discipline in the university setting. And you can well have a case in this area where a prosecutor refuses to prosecute a matter, and yet you have a finding of responsibility at the university process, because they are different processes with different standards of proof. And from experience, I can tell you that That is one of the hardest things for parents in particular to understand. If you can get that out and have people understand where the university process fits in the big scheme before you have to deal with any particular matter, you have well advanced the ball.
Thank you both so much. This is really, really interesting.
Thank you for tuning in to Reasonably Speaking. Visit ali.org to learn more about this important topic and our speakers. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Reasonably Speaking is produced by the American Law Institute with audio engineering by Kathleen Morton and digital editing by Kristen Evans. Podcast episodes are moderated by Jennifer Marinigo, and I'm Sean Kellum.